So I'm going to talk about Henry Jenkins's article on narrative in game design. He starts by talking about ludology, which is the study of games and gaming, especially video games. The ludologists study how people play them, cultures, player cultures. They analyze games for all kinds of things, images, and user experience. A huge part, in fact, of understanding games is understanding user experience, the user interface, for instance, and how it looks and its feel. There's a famous book about interface design called Don't Make Me Think, and it's not that digital resources that have interfaces like video games, it's not that they don't want you to think, it's that they don't want you to think about the trivial things, just as when you read a book, you don't think about turning the page. You don't have to think about that or about shutting or opening the book. So there are a lot of rules about how to create really nice interfaces that designers study. And the other term that's important for understanding how video games work, digital games, is user experience design. So UI is interface, UX is user experience. People really talk about UIX, which is both together. Really, the user interface is a part of the whole experience of a digital project, including video games. So let's get back to Jenkins. Jenkins says, first of all, one of the reasons that digital games, video games involve narrative is because we inhabit a world of transmedia storytelling. And what you're looking at here is the first edition of Frankenstein from 1819, the novel by Mary Shelley. It's a pretty far cry from how we imagine the monster looked. This is a play that came out shortly after the novel Frankenstein in 1823. It was called Presumption. That's the play frontispiece. And then here is a reproduction of the play that's a little bit later. You can see one of the first movies, 1910. The Edison Kinetogram was a newsletter that talked about it, was Frankenstein. There's the monster. And Boris Karloff was in Frankenstein. Mel Brooks wrote a funny movie, Young Frankenstein. There have been Frankenstein movies almost every year. The one here is from 2015. And all kinds of spin-offs, like The Bride of Frankenstein was a famous movie. A ton of movies about Frankenstein, none of which completely reproduce the novel, because you can't achieve the same effects in a movie that you can in a novel. So in a novel, you can go inside people's heads and hear what they're thinking. You can't do that in a movie. The way you get at what people are feeling in a movie is you have them talk about it, or you have their expressions, or you have the environment that they're in and what it's like. Somebody who's really upset, maybe walking through a storm. Kenneth Branagh made a movie called Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It wasn't just called Frankenstein. And then the plot is really, really different from the novel. But in this Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I think one of the reasons he calls it Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is because he's really trying to get at how much Victor wanted to create life because he was traumatized by his mother's death and wanted to be with Elizabeth forever. So in this movie, Victor brings Elizabeth back to life after the monster kills her. And then he and the monster battle over who gets her. That's not in the novel at all, the original novel. There she is, reborn, her head put on another body that was still livable. So Henry Jenkins says, that we live in this transmedia world, and so a lot of games and a lot of images bring narrative with them. But he says primarily game designers don't just only tell stories, they design worlds and sculpt spaces. So space has a kind of storytelling effect. He says game consoles should be regarded as machines for generating compelling spaces, and with these compelling spaces, compelling stories. I mean, how could a space be compelling otherwise than as a story? So he talks about spatial storytelling. He talks about spatial storytelling, and he says that there are 4 kinds of elements of it. First, spatial storytelling. Digital games evoke pre-existing narrative associations. He talks about pirates, like all the association with pirates. But Frankenstein, if there's a Frankenstein game or a Star Wars game or anything like that, they evoke pre-existing narrative associations. Video games also provide a staging ground where the narrative is enacted. And these video games embed narrative information within what he calls their mise en scène, their staging, and I'll say more about that in a minute. The last thing is providing resources for emergent narrative. But let's talk about mise en scène. So mise en scène, it's really a film term from the French, and it means the setting or the surroundings of an event or action. And technically, I think it refers to the frame and the camera work. So everything in the frame of a movie can carry meaning is what directors and creators of film believe. Whereas when you're reading a novel, you're kind of piecing together the story from little clues you get here and there, from flashbacks, from people talking. You kind of piece together the whole set of chronological events on which the story is based, and sort of triangulate who's who and where. What video games do is they kind of give you sort of pieces of stories. And those pieces of stories can contain story elements. For instance, Joseph Campbell has written a lot about the life of the hero. And he says, the hero is always born under strange circumstances where one or more parents are missing. And that's true from Moses to Hercules. And then the hero is called to adventure. He has to cross a threshold where he has a mentor and a helper. He goes through challenges and temptations and quests and gets helpers on the quests. He kind of goes through a death and rebirth thing. It may not be literal death, but it's something, and is transformed by that and atones for whatever he needs to atone for, and then returns finally to being who he truly is, or she. So narrative and games, they can be based on these elements of a hero's life. They're episodic, they're made up of episodes, and each piece of action or localized incident is a little story on its own. And the episodes or set pieces, sometimes you can reorder them without affecting the story. And in games, that is literally true often, because often you can take a different path and get a different piece of a story or a different episode, and it doesn't matter to the experience of the game. The goals and conflicts and are broadly defined so that game players can choose their own way and their own way of handling things. Of course, you do die if you handle it absolutely the wrong way, but there may be multiple ways to live and continue and complete the quest. And Jenkins calls these localized incidents little micro-narratives, small narratives. They can be cutscenes, like in a video game you can have like a little sort of film that comes into the game and explains part of the narrative, but they don't have to be. They could be quests or meetings with various people or things like that. So the plot in games And this gets back to embedded narrative. The plot in a novel, it's really invented by the author. And games don't make you stick to a really strict plot the way an author does, or as Jenkins says, Alfred Hitchcock does in movies. In games, you have the more freedom to choose how the story goes. Um, and when we talk about narrative, people typically make the distinction between plot, like how the plot unfolds in the novel. So in the novel, first you meet the hero, and then second there's a flashback where you find out this, and then third it a character runs into his aunt who tells a story, and fourth, so it can unfold any way. But the story, the actual chronological series of events, are what you piece together from that unfolding. And that would just be from, 1900 to 2000. It would be, March year by year in chronological order. Now, narratives typically have strict plot, and they drag the reader around by the neck. But you don't want that in video games. What you want to do with video games is you want to embed the narrative into the environment so that the gamer discovers it as he or she moves through the environment. All of the items on this side of the table are passive. A little bit passive. I have to say, when you read a novel, you do a lot in your mind in terms of imagining what everything looks like. So that part is active, but you don't invent parts of the story, whereas games are immersive, people believe, because they involve you in the creation of the story as much as there is one. Games seem a lot to be based on film noir, and I think Jenkins just mentions this briefly, but they always look so dark to me, and film noir has reasons for darkness and light. You can kind of see this figure here who's a policeman in the dark, maybe evil, maybe they're trying to get out of a system of rules that's unfair. In this light, you can see that the light and dark are really stark, so that shadows are cast. And this man's shadow suggests his stealthy attempt to overhear what those people are saying. Melodrama, which the first one I ever saw, and this is it, is Dark Shadows, which is really old, the first television melodrama I ever saw. And Dark Shadows, it always started with a picture of the mansion, and the mansion's always in a storm situation, right? And these figures, I think he ends up being a vampire, and pretty sure he ends up being a werewolf. He sure looks like he should be with those sideburns. I don't know if I watched the whole thing, but here they are inside the mansion. And for the mise-en-scène, for the kind of emotions being projected into the environment, you can see it's all dark and then starkly light. And, a fire, it's always cold. The fire suggests that that these people are always cold. And the art and the objects, there's no mess in here. It's all perfectly ordered and structured, but you feel like maybe something could be seething beneath that structure, especially with this serpentine chair here, this snake-like chair. What's lurking behind that structure? And that's a way of projecting emotions into an environment. So again, just to summarize, there are 4 ways, Jenkins says, to map narrative onto space. There are evocative spaces, and we've spaces that evoke emotions in people. There's enacting stories, so characters or players in a game structure some of the stories by their actions. There's embedded narratives embedded in the game space. So you might, find a map, or find a half of a key or a ring that has a matching ring or something. And so those items that you find in the space, or the way that the space is built, that there's a cave opening here, kind of suggests stories. How many horror movies have you watched where somebody opens a door and goes down into a dark basement? It's like, just don't go, right? But an open door into a dark basement is definitely about going down into it and being terrified by what you find down there. It's just a story that's part of a scene. And emergent narratives are the narratives that emerge from the gameplay. And some video games really allow for a lot of emergent narrative. Some digital games, like The Sims, are all emergent narrative. There's nothing else, pretty much. Very, very loose structure with the space and the items in it. Okay, that's Henry Jenkins.